Good morning. I'm Emily Freeman. I'm thrilled to be here with you, whether it's morning or afternoon or evening, wherever you are. I released my book, DevOps for Dummies, in August 2019. I still can't believe it, or that, we've been hiding in our houses for the last year, but it was such an accomplishment. And I actually don't want to talk about DevOps for Dummies or its contents. You'll hear plenty about the fundamentals and implementation of DevOps at this event. Instead, I want to set the tone. I want to talk about my experience of writing the book, about creating something from nothing, and how I believe the creative process parallels our work as engineers. My editor would like me to tell you that you can order DevOps for Dummies on Amazon. I would absolutely love to hear what you think about it. Writing a book is the hardest achievement I set out to accomplish. I finished it like a marathoner at the end of a long race, crawling toward the finish line. I was empty. But finishing the book isn't the interesting story. The journey is where I learned the valuable lessons. Only in the tears and the toil, in the mud of my own emotions and self-doubt, did I learn the truths of struggle, resiliency, and creative work. Long ago, communities believed a person's creative contributions were the work of a muse. They believed the gifts that we value most from these ancient civilizations, sculptures, paintings, books, were the result of a human momentarily capturing the divine. And you don't have to believe in a God to recognize when someone has, for a moment, transcended the limitations of human brokenness and achieved something truly awe-inspiring. When this era of the muse passed, we discovered science. We began to understand pieces of the universe we inhabit. We moved away from this old godlike division of labor. We stopped recognizing the muses and the gods and the divine. Instead, we praised the art, the result. More importantly, we began to worship humans. We began to believe that those artists and creators were somehow superior. Engineering is creative work. Yes, we talk about algorithms and lambdas. We're very clever, but our work transcends science and technology. And throughout the creative process of building something from nothing, we must strike this balance between influencing the outcome and stepping back to allow the work to define itself. If I were to write a book on writing, it would be titled Lessons Learned from Staring at Carpet Fibers. Because there's a lot of rolling around on the floor, wallowing in self-pity before you ever write a single word. Michelangelo, the man who gave us David and the Pieta, believed every block of stone had a statue in it. And it was the task of the sculptor to discover it. And maybe, go with me on this, maybe we are sculptors, slowly chipping away at marble until the sculpture beneath begins to surface. Only instead of a chisel in hand, we type away at our keyboards, coaxing machines to do our will. Now, I know engineering doesn't feel that glamorous, no matter what side you're on, dev or ops. I think engineering can be extremely lonely work. And if you're anything like me, it can fill you with imposter syndrome and self-doubt just as quickly as it can make you feel like a god. In many ways, this industry has created a cult of celebrity. We worship the technologists with the most Twitter followers or open source contributions. We look to the people on stages or on cameras as experts instead of peers. And we seek to prove ourselves worthy rather than build a community of vulnerability and acceptance. I did more DevOps while writing this book. I thought about where I fit in this community and the type of environment we're building in tech. If you're new to DevOps, you'll notice we talk about people, process, and tools in that order, because the tools you use are far less important than the people for whom you build products and the people with whom you work. But I want to focus on that second item for a moment, process. For me, the process of writing, like software development, has a rhythm, an emotional ebb and flow. This is the Gartner hype cycle. Gartner uses it to teach companies that can afford Gartner how to approach user adoption. But I think it does an incredibly good job at capturing the emotional rise and fall we all experience as humans when taking on a new project or challenge, especially a big one. When I was offered the book, I was elated. I haven't felt joy and anticipation like that in a long time. I felt like a success, like I had somehow arrived. And I kept imagining myself walking into a bookstore, finding the text section and taking the book off the shelf, really holding it in my hands. That feeling is the peak of inflated expectations. It's your brain dumping large amounts of dopamine into your system. I imagine myself like Hemingway, typing away and clearly conveying my thoughts on DevOps, minus the Cuban views and rum, though more on rum and other booze later. I wasn't like Hemingway. It wasn't sexy or glamorous. It was hard. It was lonely. And it was a lot of work. It felt daunting, impossible even. And I felt as if I was going to be the greatest disappointment, especially to the people who had taken a risk on me. I really struggled. I don't want to gloss over that fact. I think too often we see the highlight reel of others and we compare it to the behind the scenes footage of our own internal storm. It's a false comparison. It isolates us from each other. It cheats us of truth and community, something that I think is central to DevOps organizations. The closer we're able to get to a shared experience, the more we begin to understand each other as humans. The struggle that follows that peak of inflated expectations is the trough of disillusionment. This is your brain viewing the opportunity ahead of you as a danger to your safety. Your brain was never designed to help you become your most enlightened self, nor was it designed to help you accomplish feats of grandeur. The oldest part of your brain, way back here, thinks your job is basically to be born, reach reproductive age, replicate your cells, and that's about it. Your brain views opportunities as risks, and it thinks of risk as a lion who wants to eat you. Your brain will always opt for safety over uncertainty, even if it means you miss out on opportunities. It's this part of your brain that you are at war with during the trough of disillusionment. It's a dark time, and I spent most of my time writing in this space. The only reason I was able to keep producing, despite intense struggle, was because I had friends, a lot of whom were authors, who lifted me up, gave me pep talks, especially when I was ready to throw in the towel and quit. I tweeted this in early December 2018, when I was about 30% of the way through the book. It is alarmingly accurate, this tweet. And if you really look at it and change a few words, it probably mirrors your experience of engineering solutions to really hard problems. Step one is to hem and haw. This is the procrastination phase. It's the roll around on the floor until you feel mildly less overwhelmed phase. In this part of the trough of disillusionment, you'll think about writing, but you'll be distracted by the state of disorder in your closet or some need for freshly baked cookies. I stress bake, so you can imagine how many cookies I've consumed over the last year during this pandemic. Let's not tell my doctor about that. It's not good, okay? It's our secret. Step 2 is to question your credentials. Imposter syndrome is a blast. This phase is mostly listening to that little voice in your head that tells you you're not good enough, that you shouldn't even try, that someone else would be better. As you might know, my second career is tech. I don't have a CS degree. I didn't build a server farm from my parents' garage at 8, and I did not teach myself Fortran at 15. In this phase, the incessant whisper of self-doubt left me feeling as if I wasn't qualified, wasn't good enough. And I oddly became obsessed with what Gene Kim would think of my book. Gene Kim, if you don't know, has authored or co-authored nearly every well-known book in DevOps. And I spent months thinking about what a disappointment DevOps for Dummies would be to Gene, until I finally got it through my head that Gene didn't know who I was and didn't care. Step 3 is to experience an existential crisis. You may or may not need a therapist and or friendly bartender to get you through the self-doubt initiated by your negative self-talk. I did most of my writing at night. I worked a full-time job, I traveled for conferences, and I'm a single mom, which means my evenings are monopolized by my now 6-year-old daughter. Back then, I would put my daughter to bed, sit next to her, hunched over my laptop in the dark. I'm pretty sure I have permanent back damage. That cursor would just sit there on the blank page, taunting me, blinking, 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 silently reminding me that I had written nothing. Until by some miracle, I'd happened to put some words on a page. Some nights and weekends when my daughter was away, I would go downstairs to the bar I lived above and write. I was at the bar so frequently with my laptop that regulars started wondering what the woman in the hood was doing. It was there that I'd have this momentary lift of productivity. I'd feel good until I made the mistake of reading what I wrote and hated it. And then in my dismay, I would draw diagrams because if I couldn't write a good book, I was determined to make a damn good picture book. Now, when I realized Wiley wouldn't pay me for 250 pages of charts and graphics, I did manage to write some more, which point I would begin drinking, or more likely continue drinking until it was bedtime. After that break away from work, I would review it and wait, love it? What? I am a genius. Of course I deserve to be writing a book. That momentary feeling of greatness would be quickly dismissed by a sense of uneasiness washing over me. I would return crashing to earth and feel utterly confused as to how the piece of crap I wrote last night turned into great writing by morning. The whisper of imposter syndrome would return, reminding me that someone else would think it's bad and let me know just that in big, bold, red edits. Her name was Susan. I spent months in the trough of disillusionment until I began to normalize. I realized that I was writing a book on DevOps, not the book on DevOps. And if it really sucked, who cared? If the trough of disillusionment is that moment you jump out of a plane and begin to plummet toward the earth, the slope of enlightenment is that moment after the parachute opens, your rate of descent steadies, and you begin to pleasantly take in the world around you as you drift down. You realize that the emotional ups and downs are just part of the process, and that the process will eventually end. At which point you reach the plateau of productivity, where you finally feel like you have some clue what you're doing. And you know that if you just keep writing, you'll have time to edit it into something at least mediocre, probably good, and maybe, just maybe, great. So after all that, who is excited about writing a book? But seriously, if you're wondering if I would recommend writing a book, the answer is yes. Yes, absolutely. It is one of the best ways of promoting yourself and creating career opportunities down the road. Thanks to authority bias, Everyone gives authors way too much credit. They assume they're an expert. Obviously, I mean, they wrote a book on it, right? I grew a lot as a person and a professional while writing DevOps for Dummies. The lessons I learned in the struggle and how I can apply them to my work in engineering were beyond valuable. Just recognize that it's not glamorous, not in the process. It is a marathon through mud, and it's easier to quit than it is to fight through the struggle. Some of the best advice I received is that the first book is the hardest, which hilariously assumes you are willing to write a second book. At that point, you think you can write a book, but you don't know for sure. You've never done it. And I think that applies to more than just writing books. The first time you do anything is the hardest, which is why you need to make a plan and then probably throw it away. Creating a table of contents was the first step of writing a book. The publisher literally demands it when you're pitching the book. It's essentially the planning phase of it. And plans are great. They manage to get you headed in a particular direction. But sometimes, I would argue most of the time, you can't get to the destination unless you throw the original plan away, which, as you might imagine, may give your manager and or editor an aneurysm. But tossing the plan isn't failure. It's adaptation. It's continuous improvement, a concept central to DevOps. There is this moment in creative work, and perhaps especially in writing, where the work begins to declare itself. And the image of what you want the book to be meets with what the book believes itself to be. Now, I know that sounds a little bit wacky, right? And yes, I'm in Colorado. It's a little woo-woo-woo. I'm anthropomorphizing a book. However, it's exactly what happens. The book will guide you to create the book it wants to be. My father calls this part of writing catching fire. It's where the toil of typing transforms into flow. And I'm not talking about value stream mapping. I'm talking about the Mihai Csikszentmihalyi concept of flow, a state of being completely involved in an activity for its own sake. The ego falls away, time flies. Every action, movement, and thought follows inevitably from the previous one, like playing jazz. If you're a developer, you've likely felt this at some point in your career. After a struggle at the start, the code sort of begins to write itself. You overcome the initial challenges and you begin to know what you need to do next. A plan is a guide, not a prison. You were never locked into the particular strategy you thought would work. When you're staring at a mountain, you make assumptions about how to climb it and which paths to take. You can prepare for expected challenges, but it's not until you're 2 hours from base camp and a snowstorm moves in that you really know what you need to do. Don't stick to the original plan just because it's convenient or feels safer. Make adjustments, iterate, pivot. But don't expect it to be smooth or comfortable. Growth is painful. It's also part of the process. I grew an incredible amount through writing this book as a person, as a writer, as a technologist. Growth is awkward and uncomfortable. It exposes the areas in which you're not particularly impressive. That's for all of us. It requires candor and vulnerability. It would be easier to act as if you knew everything, like you had it all handled all the time. Only the most courageous of us freely admit when we don't know and create space for the people around us to teach us. This entire process was a daily reminder that the more I learn, the less I know, and that ego is the enemy of learning. When I joined a powerlifting team years ago, they had one rule, and it was that I needed to leave my ego at the door. There was simply no room for pride. And no, I never had quads like that. I wish I did. The woman is a beast. My little group of powerlifters pushed me more than any other group ever had. And there is nothing like a 300-pound man yelling at you because you didn't try hard enough. It's extremely motivating. It was the epitome of tough love. They pushed me because they loved me. They believed I could do better, even when I didn't. We talk a lot about removing friction between teams and allowing people to work well with each other. But a certain amount of friction is healthy. It's how we grow, as long as it's in a safe and healthy environment. It's through working through that friction with our colleagues and our friends that we begin to form real trust. Don't fight procrastination. Writing a book is torturous in part because when you're writing, you hate writing. And when you're not writing, you feel guilty because you should be writing. I spent a ton of time procrastinating. I cleaned, I watched TV, I moaned to friends about how hard writing a book is. I delayed. But by the end, I realized procrastination is actually a really healthy part of the creative process. You're not avoiding work. You're doing work. It just doesn't quite feel like it, and usually doesn't look like it either. In all the time I was rolling around the carpet, moaning and feeling bad for myself, my brain was sorting out how I wanted to tackle a topic as broad and as encompassing as DevOps. And eventually, all the procrastination work paid off. I think I wrote a pretty good book. That said, the first draft of anything is going to suck. How many of you have spent a week solving a hard problem, created the most gnarly string of code to do a thing, only to throw it out and rewrite your solution in just a few hours? You can't edit nothing, but you can polish a turd. Terry Pratchett said the first draft is just you telling yourself the story, which is beautiful. Though I personally prefer Hemingway's honest take. The first draft of anything is shit. Maybe the first draft is horrible. You will make it better, but you have to start somewhere. Perfection is impossible. We're humans, we are flawed. There is nothing empirically perfect on the face of this earth. But I believe in the pursuit of perfection. We may achieve greatness. This is the Nike of Samothrace, the winged victory, the nightly alighting a worship. She goes by many names. Nike is the personification of victory, and this statue at the Louvre is one of my absolute favorites. There are moments of absolute perfection in this piece. Look at her belly, where the sheer fabric is sweeping around her body in the wind. The sculptor made stone delicate, translucent. That, in my opinion, is divine. But the sculpture as a whole has some problems. For one, she's missing a head. Now, that's not the sculptor's fault. It's time's. But it was a wonderful metaphor, I think, for creative output. You have very little control over how your work is received, or if it's even remembered. The only thing we have control over is the work we put into it and the personal growth we glean from the experience. Maybe we should measure ourselves and each other by that, the input, the work, and remind ourselves that the outcome is far less important. Which brings me to my last point. We need each other. I want to go back to step 8 for a minute. I'm going to be real with you right now. Drinking became a part of my habit of writing. One liver was harmed in the making of this book. When I was writing, I was typically drinking. And it got to the point that I actually feared I wouldn't be able to write without a drink in my hand. Stephen King talks about this. The drugs and alcohol became such a deep-seated aspect of his writing process that he feared he would never be able to quit because he wouldn't be able to write without it. Drinking while writing was a way of quieting the fears of failure attempting to partially enjoy a process that felt brutal and endless. For me, I think we drink and we do drugs and we gamble and we do 1,000 other things to distract us from our own fears and anxiety. Whew, that is heavy. But so is the experience of being human. We expect so much from ourselves. I think at the core of each of us is a child who's a little bit scared and wants to belong. The fear and anxiety many of us carry around every day can become so oppressive that it can begin to feel like you can't even breathe. I want you to know that you're not alone, even when you feel your loneliest, even when you feel like you have no one to call. We all struggle. And if we could create an environment of that courageous vulnerability, we wouldn't have to feel alone. We get to struggle together. It's for this reason that I want to go back to the ethos of the age of muses, when the brilliant work of an artist was a momentary capture of the divine. Because if you believe that you create great work that exceeds the reaches of average humans all on your own, and then you fail, what does that say about you? And more than that, what can we possibly do to form meaningful connections with each other if we see some humans as demigods? Community, trust, requires each of us to view ourselves as equals. We have to stop putting people on pedestals. That goes for me and every other person in this industry. We must be a community in which everyone respects and admires the different contributions of each individual. At this conference, you have the opportunity to connect with hundreds of engineers. And yes, it's virtual, but it still counts. After this talk, I'll be on Discord to chat, and I'm excited to get to know each of you and answer some of your questions. In all of these conversations, I challenge you to be vulnerable with your peers, to share your successes and your failures freely and courageously. Being vulnerable is one of the most courageous acts anyone could take. And if someone is courageous enough to be real with you, to be their authentic self, meet them where they're at, accept them, and return the gift of vulnerability. Maybe, just maybe, we can all go back to our workplaces and show that it's not tech at the heart of DevOps. It's humans. It's you. Thank you so much for joining me today. It has been an absolute honor. And I am thrilled to meet with all of you in Discord just after this. Thank you so much.